Welcome to Baby Jail Unlocked, the podcast where we peel back the layers of very common early childhood and education practices and ask what's really going on here. I'm your host, Dr. Chloe Keegan, and you may be wondering why I've been really in the digital space lately. So, as you may remember, the last two episodes, I was joined by Amit Kalley and Harry Houghton, and both of them had amazing, very insightful, and in some cases, quite worrying insights into the digital spaces for children. So while some people may have been questioning, well, how is this relevant to the early years or to education? Of course, it is relevant to children. This episode, I will be covering and tying up all their arguments on why it's so important for early years educators, adults, people with young children to be really, really immersed in digital well-being and understanding the impacts that this space can have on children if we're not really aware of the harm and risks that we may be putting them at. So let's get straight to it. Welcome to Baby Jail Unlocked. So preschools in the digital age, why it's different now is the context has very much changed. So if you think of early years preschools and settings now, they're vastly different to the landscape that we had 5 or 10 years ago in terms of technology. So if we're thinking of examples, I'm sure there's some preschools or someone you know of where they are using these digital learning platforms or digital learning apps, such as Story Park or Family. And they're using them to record and share children's learning as and when it happens. And they're sharing this information with parents. There's also a lot of instant communication happening. So you would have instant communication with parents through the service, through educators, through management, and it's all through emails or apps. There's also hundreds of photos and videos taken of children per year in preschool. So again, think of you being an educator or a person working with children, 22 children, each of them are documented in terms of videos and photos every month, every season, and then every year. That's a lot of content. Then not only that, but you have the layer of sensitive information. So you have to think about the things like behavior notes, developmental concerns, health data in some cases, how all this data, this content is being stored in cloud-based systems or digital files that children and parents potentially know where it's being stored. But the other side of it is, do we really actually know where that's being stored and how it's being managed? The one area that I'm most concerned about at the minute is preschools posting children's activities on social media solely for marketing. You know it's not for the purpose of sharing children's learning to the public. You know, based on the content and how it's generating this content and promoting this content, it's for marketing. It's to make money. It's to engage parents to attend the service or be proud that their child is attending. So it's very much for engagement purposes. So there's a lot of examples of where preschools nowadays are very much moving towards a technological landscape, if you want to call it that. But what I want to discuss is understanding what that really means then for children's rights, privacy, and long-term digital well-being. So the first thing I want to talk about is consent. So there's a difference between consent and understanding, which is really important to decipher between. So, for example, you might have preschools and they get parental consent at enrollment or as an activity happens. But the thing with this type of consent is it doesn't mean informed understanding of the process. So what I would question is, do parents understand that their child may have hundreds of images uploaded to third-party servers? Do they know where these servers are hosted? So for example, when I was in work, I was learning about how you can be engaged on a Zoom platform, but where that data is saved, you might think I'm saving it on the Zoom website, but it may be hosted in the USA. So that data may be shared in the USA. So these are things to be aware of. The other thing is also wondering about the option to limit. So do parents have the option to limit how their child is being photographed or included in digital records? The biggest issue is, and of course this is going to be my positioning, is the child's consent. So we need to consider these very young children rarely have their views sought in general, let alone about the videos or photos being taken of them. So we have to consider, what are the practices that we're engaging in, and are they considering the child's view directly, Or are we just taking photos and videos of children for our own purposes, whether it's to prove documenting of learning or to sell the service? One thing that I've started to learn a little bit more about, because it's something that I have no idea of up until now, I'm learning as I go, but it's this loss of control over data. So it's a very interesting space to be reading and researching about, because every platform, even the ones that are well known or the ones that are well respected, they all involve some risk of data leakage or security breaches or inappropriate access in some way. So the more platforms a service has, a preschool service now has, think of your apps, your email, your social media, your storage. So the more potential entry points, as they're called, as I am now learning the terminology, but the more, as you call them, potential entry points that a service has, the more likely that they're going to be at risk of a breach or their content data being accessed and being misused. There's other things that you have to consider as well, as in terms of your devices that you have in your service. Are they password protected? Are there, backups encrypted? Do staff ever store content on personal phones or emails? Now, I know in my own experience, while this is going back a few years, it was always not directly encouraged, but because we didn't have the equipment, we didn't have a designated camera or a designated phone to take pictures. We would typically use our own phone, take it, then move the pictures from our phone to the service via email or via just a USB charger. But that data was being transferred from one device to another. So again, that is quite a risky practice to be aware of. Another thing, and the last thing that I want to talk about as well, is this idea of, well, what happens when a child leaves? So if we're putting this into context, you are sharing data or pictures or videos of children on your social media as a service provider or manager or educator. And what happens when that child leaves your service? Are their photos and videos deleted, or does it sit on these platforms indefinitely? Also, in terms of your actual storage, your computer storage, in terms of their visual data, what are the timelines for deleting these? The one thing that I want to really highlight as well is, when you're looking at social media, I know, as I've seen previous services that I've worked in, or some that I would engage in at the minute, you definitely see preschool social media where the content goes back years. I mean, years and years. And I can see early years children that are now in after school or that are now in primary. It's just something to consider yourself, is how long do you keep this visual data on public platforms like social media, for example, because that's something that we need to discuss later in this episode, as we will. But the idea of how risky and how harmful that potentially can be for the children that you're marketing through these platforms. So marketing is one thing I'm quite concerned about, because typically you're marketing something, if you're marketing a person, that's commodifying them. So you're using them as an object to make money. And there is a lot of that. I mean, at the end of the day, the amount of times I've heard the early years sector being described as a business. And I see it. I see how the parent is the customer and the child is the product, and the service provider is the provider. So the issue with marketing is it's heavily infringing on children's rights. So if we talk about it more broadly, you would think of many services and how they post photos online to showcase, as I said, how great this preschool is and how parents should bring their child to this preschool. But this often puts children's privacy, safety, and digital footprint at risk. So even with parental consent, there's many issues going on. So what happens if an image online that's found on a public social media account is reshared without permission? So that's something that we need to be very aware of. There's a lot of posting happening online, mine included, LinkedIn, Instagram. But if you're a service provider or an educator that's using social media to promote children and their activities and their learning, what boundaries, or if any, do you have about people who follow you or follow the service page? Are they allowed to reshare this? Because if they are, then that person is resharing that content then to their audience, which you don't know who they are. And that again increases the risk of children's content being misused, and potentially putting them at risk. So we have to also look at thinking of images when children are on images of children online, and how they would feel when they're 14, 18, 25. Harry, in a previous episode, made a great point, which is the idea that everything that we as adults, especially in a certain generation, have been responsible for what's been put online. So I know everything that's put online because I go out of my way to post it. I'm responsible and I'm in charge. Whereas it's completely different now for children that are being documented. They're being recorded, videoed in all different aspects of life. That stuff, that content, that data is being shared on platforms online. And the issue is children don't have a say in this content or how it's shared or who looks at it, if ever. So there's a massive gray area here about sharing videos and imagery and information in general, even if it's about an art activity. You don't know how that child is going to feel when they're 8, 12, 18, and as an adult. So we have to really consider, not only can we, are we permitted, are we allowed to post children online? But my question is, should we? Now, quite honestly, I don't feel there's a purpose for posting children online by any means necessary, because typically I see it being children being posted online by adults who are seeking something else, which is praise or money or attention. So it's a little bit unnerving when I see now how that technological landscape is infiltrating the early years sector, while being promoted in a way that it's advocating for learning and education and sharing insights into childhood. But I think that is personally a lot of guff. It's a lot of guff to normalize these kind of technology spaces that we as adults have normalized and infiltrated into our own lives. And now we find such use in it that we're now looking to put it towards our earlier sector. And then we have to think about, while now it seems all well and good, well, I'm just promoting children's artwork, I'm just promoting, our wonderful outdoor space, what's the issue? The issue is, if you have children in your content, you have no idea how those specific children will feel about the fact that hundreds of photos and videos exist of them when they were 3, 4, 5, and now it still exists when they're 12, 13, 14, and as an adult. Again, I need to emphasize, I grew up in a space where the luxury was I was responsible for generating whatever is online by myself. I can't imagine my mom or my dad or my teachers documenting me from very young ages all the way up to 18, and having no control over where my images are and what they're shared on and what they're of. And the issue with that is you're thinking the long-term digital footprints of children, and how, while a service may innocently think, look, this is a great photo and it's going to really show how much children learn in this environment. That's wonderful. And I genuinely believe in the learning in early years, of course, because this is my field. But I don't believe that we should promote it on social media, because there's too much harm and there's too much potential for risk for children now and in the long run. So what I would ask, not only can we share these photos of children online, and can we adapt them so they're more child-centered and more protected of their identity? I just scrap all those questions at this point, and I would be asking, should we post children online? I think you'll get a sense of my positioning would be, I don't think there's any argument that you could tell me where children, yes, should be shared online. I think if children are controlling their own digital footprint, absolutely. But in the space of early years, you're talking babies, toddlers, and young children, I don't feel that there's any reason to be sharing content of children online, publicly or privately. I think it can be done in a way where parents can engage with educators to learn and keep up with the developmental learning and the progress and the activities of children. but I don't feel it needs to be done on wider platforms or through apps where it's, say, parent groups or like WhatsApp and things like that. I think there are other ways that we can promote and celebrate children's learning without needing it to be shared across such wide digital platforms. So I can appreciate that these digital advances that are coming into the early years environment are very helpful, but that's the point. They're designed to be helpful. But there's often inconsistency in what I see as terms of ethical guidance and consistent training and even awareness of, well, what's really happening behind the platform? Can we really take it at face value? I mean, if you have the biggest companies such as Meta, Facebook, being under such litigation because of their lack of safeguarding, can we really trust these new up and coming developments in technology that are saying, yes, we will mind and protect your data, but are they? So again, it just comes back to the not can we share children online, but should we? And in terms of staff, it's common practice. I've seen it. I've done it when there was less understanding about the impact here. I mean, even 5 years ago. But you would have, of course, staff, and maybe you do it all the time. I know I would have. But staff may use their personal phones to take photos, as I've discussed. Some people may store photos in unprotected galleries, and I've seen this, and it's quite disheartening. It's the pressure to document children rather than interact with children. So when we have a system that promotes surveillance and advocates for, well, you need to document everything that the child does, whether it's to celebrate or whether it's to take note of a behavior, either way, these practices lead to over surveillance of children, loss of spontaneity in play. I mean, play cannot exist in that regime. But also it reduces the staff-child interaction in terms of its quality and in terms of its existence. So if digital documentation becomes more about ticking boxes or impressing parents than supporting children's journey, then we've completely lost sight of our purpose in early years, which is to celebrate children in the moment with them, not stand behind a screen and document them as if they're zoo animals. So I want to pause for a sec and just ask a question, which is something that I was considering when I was collecting my data for my own research. And it came from an incident where a little girl, she was 4 years of age, let's call her Amy. Her educator, and I'm going to describe it as swarming her. So she was behind the phone and the educator was trying really hard to capture Amy on her bike. Really, really hard. The main intention for trying to capture the perfect picture at this moment was because it was the end of the month and the educator needed to have every child a photo to go with their observation. So this was one child that, needed the photo. She didn't have the perfect photo to send to the parent. So the educator was walking around the child, not talking to the child, just click, 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 click. And the child, interestingly enough, asked, "Why do you take my photo?" And the educator, of course, stumped. I mean, if I was at that as an educator, I would have been babbling. But it was the fact that the educator turned around and said quite straightforward, "This is to show Mammy and Daddy what you do in preschool." And I found that interesting because, again, it just shows the intent is not to be child-centered in any way. It's the marketing lens. You're marketing towards parents as consumers. You're trying to prove that, well, you're paying for this service, but at the end of the day, the parent needs to see the return. So me as the educator, I need to prove that you paying for your child to be here is valuable, is worthy. It's interesting because at no point was that child asked, "Can I take your photo?" And even then, in this normalized practice, I would even be hesitant in promoting asking children, "Can I take your photo?" Because inherently children will say yes. They want to please you. They want to do something that they think they will be praised for. I don't believe that they actually understand the long-term effects of this image in the moment of saying cheese. The most scary thing that I witnessed in my research in this topic was the fact that in instances with other children, an educator could pick up a phone and take a photo of a child, and as soon as the child registered that their photo was being taken, they automatically, without prompt, went, "Cheese." Frightening. Like, it is frightening because I remember growing up having conversations about photos and taking photos, and will we say cheese? Will we say something else? There was interaction and there was conversation. But there's none of that now. You just have an adult, a screen, and a child. And it just happens. It just happens and then it's gone. And no one's really looking to consider what's actually happening here. So when we're thinking of children and asking their consent and even understanding them, it's not hypothetical. This is not something that would be just good practice. This is supporting the UNCRC, the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, because children have the right to privacy and the right to be heard. So a truly rights respecting preschool includes the child's perspective in all decisions, including taking pictures. So you might ask, think of staff. You need to reflect on, are we explaining to children why we're taking their photos? Chances are you're not. You're just doing it. I know, again, I never did. Now, that's not to say practice hasn't moved on since I've been working in preschools, but it does lend a questioning era of, well, are we actually asking children about their photos? And I would stand by, well, no, I don't see it happening. I think it's important to also reflect and rehash the key warnings that Amit and Harry in the last two episodes have highlighted about the risks when photos of children are shared online without real consideration of the purpose or without actual awareness or education around the harms of engaging in digital spaces with children. So the first one, of course, is, as Harry has highlighted very clearly, the photo could be downloaded, altered, or misused, particularly now in an era with AI. And once that's posted publicly, it's no longer in your control what happens to that image. So we have to consider that anyone can screenshot images, use it, even distort it, and you'll likely never know. So that's something that someone should be very afraid of. And that's a decision that we take every day when we decide to post something online. We are deciding to take that risk. And while I'm all for risky play, this is not a risk that I think is worth taking. So the last topic I want to highlight before we get into some practical solution-focused ideas is the idea of digital well-being and that impact on young children. So even when children aren't online themselves, they're constantly learning from how technology is used around them, especially by adults. So think about these everyday moments. You have a child calling your name. Maybe they want to show you their artwork, but you're focused on uploading a photo of another child's activity to Facebook. You also may have a key worker is sitting with the group at story time, but their attention is split. So they're taking notes into a tablet, but also half reading the story or half engaged. And a child watches as staff regularly take photos. But as we've talked about, no one explains or asks for their thoughts. So these small moments matter because they shape how children think about attention and relationships and their own value in the eyes of adults. What are children even learning from these patterns? So let's talk about it. They learn screens are powerful. They regularly take adults' focus away from the here and now. Images are like currency. So the only things that get photographed are the things that seem to matter. So, oh, that's a wonderful photo, a wonderful drawing. I'll take a photo of that. Things like this is when the educator decides that something is valued. And that's what children learn. And the issue with that is children are learning then to perform. Children will learn to perform acts thinking that, well, this will get the adult's attention. Maybe this will get me the photograph that everyone gets. Maybe this will be sent to my parents when I go home. So adults, we know we're distracted. And typically in a preschool, well, we don't want to be that way, but essentially we are. Like, we may be physically present, but emotionally unavailable. And in early childhood, when brain development is rapid, I mean rapid, as we well know, relational connections are critical. So this kind of modeling where adults are distracted by screens on a regular basis, it can influence how children grow to engage with technology themselves later on. So I would question, are we teaching children without meaning to that technology takes priority over people? So we've talked about the risks, we've talked about the rights. Now it's time to get some practical solutions going. So if you're working in a preschool, you might be wondering, what can we actually do to make sure that using digital tools is done in a safe and ethical and child-focused way? So here's a simple but powerful step you can take. Hold a staff meeting to map out all of your digital systems. That might sound very basic, but you'd be surprised how often preschools are using digital tools without even realizing how much data is being created, shared, or stored. So at that meeting, ask 3 questions. The first one is, what apps or platforms are we using? So that might include documentation tools like StoryPark or Family, communication channels then like email or WhatsApp. You have storage cloud systems like Outlook and tablets used for observations. Even your social media accounts. Do you have TikTok, Facebook, Instagram? The goal here is to map out the full picture. Sometimes staff use, for example, personal devices or informal systems that aren't listed in the official policy. Maybe you're on social media, more apps than you realized. And this is where the risk creeps in. So by mapping out and being honest about it, you are able to see, well, where are our entry points for the digital world? The second question is, where is the data being stored? So you have to consider things like, is it on a password protected tablet? Is it backed up to a cloud? Is anything being saved on personal phones or USB drives? And by mapping this out, it helps you understand where the sensitive information might be sitting unprotected, especially things like photos, reports, or health information. The last question is asking then, who accesses this data? So you're thinking of, is it just the team in the classroom? Is it the whole service? Do you have multiple services where you have multiple staff working across the board? Do you have admin team, a manager, even external consultants? Who has access and can access this information? So knowing who can access what, whether they need to or not, is key to updating and upholding both your data protection policies in line with data protection law and children's right to privacy. And when you're thinking about posting things with or for parents, the point here isn't to just stop sharing. The point is to consider, well, what's the purpose? And understand and reflect on this purpose. Is it centered for the child, or is it just sharing because it's quick and it's easy and it will make us look good and it will promote the service in a great way? The last thing that you need to consider after you've done this meeting, after you've mapped out your digital spaces and your entry points in the service, then have a look at your procedure for when the child leaves the service. So do you have procedures for deleting old images, removing children's name from digital folders, closing app profiles, and ensuring parents, this is the most important, ensuring parents aren't receiving updates for a child who's no longer in your care. So it's not just about closing the physical door, the child leaves and bye, but it's very much about closing that digital door to ensure that their data is no longer being shared or advocated or promoted for anything to do with the service and is not accessible by parents present or past. The importance of holding this digital mapping staff meeting and reviewing your policies to look at your exit strategies and digital exit points for children is because you need to be able to first identify the risks. So are there any gaps in our security? Are too many people accessing our data, or are we using systems that aren't GDPR compliant? As I said, I'm just learning now that if I was to use Zoom to do an online interview in Ireland, when my information sheet says access or data will not be shared outside of Europe, but Zoom is based in the US, well, that is a breach of GDPR. So this is stuff that even us as adults are just learning. So it's vital that you're taking that step to understand, well, where are our systems sharing this data, if they are, and how is that going to affect the data of my children and the service? Then you need to update your data protection policy to make sure that it reflects this practice, not just the ideal and this is what we do, but it needs to be embedded. If you're saying things like, we delete all children's social media data as soon as they leave the service, you need to ensure that that's done, so that when a parent goes on in 5 years' time, they can't just scroll back and go, oh, well, there's my child, because that would be a breach of your own policy. I think it's really clear as well that we can make this quite simple for ourselves in terms of practice. So my perspective would be, stop posting children online in general. But of course, there's a lot of services that see the benefit of this. So at least stop sharing social media posts with children's faces in it, which I know a lot do, but also look of ways to be creative where you can even stop showing the back of their head, because while to you they're not that identifiable. But I can see that there's a child with short blonde hair and a hairband that she wears most days. That's identifiable information. So maybe sticking to things that is more generic, such as their hands or the work that they've done, that would be more promoting of their learning without actually using the children as a marketing tool or commodifying them in your social media. Now, while everything I've discussed so far is quite organizational review, I also think it's crucial, if not vital, to also reflect on that practice, that day-to-day normalizing of practice that we've discussed, where, adults are quite distracted or disconnected from children because they're prioritizing their own tasks and using technology to do so. So I think it's really important that clear boundaries are set by educators, and that's only done through reflecting and assessing, well, what do I actually do? It may mean setting boundaries such as using tablets only outside of direct learning time. So if you're doing group work, look, we're not going to document everything. We don't need to. Let's just be present in this art activity. Let's just be present outdoors while it's snowing or while it's raining or sunny. But I do have a preference for bad weather. But it's also making the point of having that protected time as you may implement at home, protected time when, okay, there's no screens now, we're sitting eating dinner. The same needs to be applied then in this education space. If you do feel that you yourself are struggling with this need to document using a tablet or a phone, that you decide, well, this is a protected activity. So it's a digital free activity for children and for staff. And that would mean then when staff are actively engaging with children during play or meal times, that the digital documentation can wait. So you're prioritizing the real world in the moment connections as it happens. Another thing that I was thinking of is the idea of assigning one staff member per day to handle digital documentation. So this would mean that one person would be in charge of documenting children's learning while the rest of the staff are able to immerse themselves in the play without that expectation or pressure to document everything. And by doing this reduces interruptions, keeps the majority of staff fully engaged with children, and rotating it daily then shares a responsibility fairly without increasing that digital burnout that staff will feel when they are constantly thinking of that digital documentation. Lastly, then, it's narrate what you're doing when you're using a device. And this helps to mitigate the whole question of children wondering, well, why are you taking my photo and where does it go? So it helps you and the child understand the purpose of this documentation. And what you might find as you narrate this documentation practice, that you go, this doesn't really have a purpose. And over time, you will reduce the reasons you're documenting and then focus on the ones that are purposeful. So the way you do it would be a simple explanation. So for example, you could say to a child, I'm using the tablet to write down how you mix those colors so carefully. I want to show your dad later. This helps children understand that screens aren't, distractions. They're tools and they serve a purpose. But also then this will limit repetition and over documentation. I mean, I've seen so much of children being 10 photos being taken of them and they've barely moved in that one moment. Like, do you really need 5 photos of the same activity from different angles? Again, I would argue no. So would one enough? Would one be enough? And that's the whole idea of there's too much focus on perfect visual documentation that can shift away staff from the actual moment and the child, and really are focusing on capturing that perfect post. And we need to move away from that. So narrating your purpose of the photos, giving children a choice. And if the child hesitates, ask, would you like me to take a picture of your painting for your portfolio? And being very aware of, if children verbally do not say no or, directly answer you, be aware of those non-verbal cues, like turning away, looking uncomfortable, or ignoring you. They're all meaningful, active participation, and you need to honor and respect them. So being in tune with that happens in interacting with children. You won't learn them behind a screen. So to sum up this episode, as much as I love deep diving into this digital space, it is time to move on to a new topic. But I do want to sum up by highlighting that you have to be very, very aware that young children are growing up in a world that they didn't choose. But the same with adults. We don't know what we're navigating and what we're dealing with in terms of technology, and neither do the companies and the platforms behind these devices that we're using. So it is our job not just to protect children now, but to ensure that we're not creating problems they'll inherit later, whether we're doing it because it's easier or because it just makes life handier for work. Whatever the reason is, if it's not based on the child and ensuring that the child is free from harm and protected from long-term risk, well, then it's going back to not can we do this, but should we? So I want to emphasize that digital responsibility, it's not about fear mongering, but it's about respect and understanding. And if we believe in children's rights, then those values have to extend to their digital lives too. So we should not be teaching just online safety as a concept and a tick box exercise, but we have to live it. We have to start with ourselves, recognizing our own relationship with technology, how that's influencing our lives long term, and then how that's then influencing children that we work with every day, whether it's in a preschool or a primary school, or even if it's the children that are part of your family. So we have to ensure that we're living the practices that are respectful and are not going to put children in harm's way now or in the long-term future. So thank you so much for being on this journey of exploration. I will note that I'm sure you can guess I am not an expert in this space, but I feel it's very important to start trying to have conversations, because I feel it's very important that to learn something, we need to at least start talking about it. So I want to again highlight the wonderful expertise of Amit Kelly and Harry Houghton, who previously were on this podcast, who helped me just navigate this world a little bit better. But I'm not quite there yet, and I would love to be able to hear people's views. I understand that some of this content might be quite challenging for people to digest, and I'm so understanding of that, because these are topics that are quite heavily rooted in our day-to-day lives, and I understand how technology is helping us in so many ways. So I would love to hear people's views and people's opinions on, is technology making education better? Is it hindering us in any way? And how do we navigate digital spaces without making it about distraction, and ensure that the priority is always the relationship with the child at the end of the day? So there's lots to consider, but we will move on from the digital space for now. But I would love to say that this door is very much open, and I would be very excited to engage in any other topics that extend from this in future episodes. So thank you as always for listening to Baby Jail Unlocked, and we will be back next week.